Hey, again, good morning. If I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting you, I'm Pete, and it's so great to be with all of you here in this room this morning. So thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us online. Glad to get things going here as we continue in talking about the wilderness. It's been an interesting series as we just kind of investigate and take a deeper look at this whole idea of sometimes in our life, we feel like we're in a wilderness, or we just don't know which way to go. And sometimes it can feel like that. It might feel like that right now in our current climate in the world. And so sometimes we're looking for answers, looking for direction, looking for which place to go. But I'm sure you've heard of this phrase, the grass is always greener on the other side. We've said that many times. I'm sure in your life you've said that plenty of times. I quite literally, my first house when I moved into, when I first moved into my house in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, I had a 1/10 of an acre in my backyard. And I remember that first house, as I sat up on the deck and I looked at it, it was like just straight mud. And that's kind of because there was this massive pine tree that was there, and it was shading my yard, and it wasn't allowing any grass to grow. But right next to me, right across the fence, my neighbor Bob had beautiful, lush green grass. And right to the other side, there was another house that wasn't taken care of well, and their grass was also green and growing too high. And so I just really wanted to have the pleasure of that 10-minute mowing my backyard, you know? So I was jealous as I looked at the two grasses on the either side. And then when I moved to Ohio, I lived in a little bit of a bigger home, but the home that I moved into was actually abandoned for a very long time. And because of that, all of the grass had become yellow. And that's just because there was dandelions instead of grass. In fact, the house was known as the Dandelion House. But right next to it, on either side and across the street, my neighbors all got their grass treated by TruGreen that would come in and go over their yards and make sure that it was just grass that was growing. And so when I moved there, everybody was pretty upset about the fact that my dandelions, you know how dandelions work, they would eventually turn into those little wispy little things that you pick up and you blow and they fly everywhere. Well, they would fly to everybody else's yard. And so everyone in the neighborhood had these little yellow dandelions growing. And so I thought to myself, I have to, because my neighbor's grass is green, I have to do the same thing. I have to make my grass green, and so I hired TruGreen to come in and make my grass green as well. But it's so interesting because when we compare and when we start looking around, it feels like sometimes when we make decisions, we end up being stuck with our decision. When we compare and we look around and we think that's better, sometimes we're thinking, I wish I would have chosen that instead. Just like on a microcosm, if you've ever gone to Froyo and you walk in and you see like the litany of all the different frozen yogurts that you can grab, and then you also look at all the thousands of toppings that you can put on them, which, you know, if you work for Froyo people know what they're doing, right? Because has anybody ever been to Froyo? Let me just see a show of hands here real quick. Yeah, okay, only 2 of you? That's lies. Okay, so when you go to Froyo, and you fill your cup, and you're thinking, I didn't get very much, and then you put those toppings in there, and you walk over, and it costs $20 for your little cup of Froyo. I mean, they know what they're doing. It's based off of weight. It's kind of crazy. But anyway, when you choose your Froyo, and you choose your toppings, and then you go sit down and you realize what somebody else picked, and you look at them and think, I should have gotten those toppings, but I'm stuck with it because I just paid $20 for my Froyo, so I've got to eat this. Or if you're at a restaurant and you look at the menu, and sometimes, I don't know if you guys get this or not, but you feel that decision fatigue where you're like, I got to choose, but then once I choose, I'm stuck with it. Or maybe if you've ever had like a best friend and you think, I chose this person as a best friend, and now we call each other best friends, and now I'm stuck with them. But it seems like sometimes the longer-term decisions have opportunities for more regret. Longer-term decisions. So if you amp it up a little bit, you walk into a guitar store and you decide, I'm going to pick that instrument. I'm telling you, I have bought several guitars in my life, and every single time, the other guy that's playing sounds better than mine. I don't know if that's just the guitar, though, to be honest. It might just be I'm not very good at playing guitar. But every time, it seems like that. Or if you buy a house, and you weigh all this ideas about what kind of house you want, how many square foot, and then you actually find the house you're looking for, and you can actually buy it because you outbid the person by like $60,000 or whatever it costs to outbid somebody these days. And then you sign your life away, right? You might feel the weight of, this is a big decision, and you feel great about it. Until you go to somebody else's house and you're like, I wish I had that one. And a little bit deeper than that, think about this. What about your spouse? When you dated them for a while and you went back and forth of whether or not you were the right one for each other, and then you decided. And this is a decision that's supposed to last for a lifetime. But sometimes we find ourselves comparing. And the longer-term decisions leave us feeling opportunities for greater regret. The bigger the decision, the bigger regret is possible. So, interesting thing, when I went to a missions trip, I went with Hope International to Ukraine. Forgive me if I've told this story before for those of you who know me, but I figured it's so good I got to tell you again. So when I went to Ukraine, this awesome thing had happened in the country of Ukraine at the time. It was a long time ago, but an awesome thing had happened. There was this revolution called the Orange Revolution. And in the Orange Revolution, the country, the people walked out into the city square, and they stood there and they waited for the government to exit the building and to basically release their control of the communist government. And so there was no guns fired or anything like that at the time. It was just a peaceful revolution, and it was no longer a communist country. So as we were prepping with Hope International to go on this trip, we were all thinking, what a great opportunity for the Ukrainian people. And also, what a great opportunity for us, because we could talk about Jesus, and nobody is going to stop us from doing that. And so we just thought this is a great, great opportunity. And then we got there, and we started talking to some of those Ukrainian people. And what was interesting about that is that they all wished that they were still in a communist country. It didn't make any sense to us Americans who lived with freedom. But for them, in communism, they all had jobs. And when communism went down, all the businesses shut down. And so they found themselves without business. And so they looked back at their past time and they thought that time was better. It's actually something, there's a term for this. It's actually something that we all do. It's a term called a hindsight bias. That we have a tendency to look back at our past, look back into our lives and compare and say that time was better than the time that we have right now. This is actually, let me show you the definition of it. It says, when humans view past events with rose-tinted glasses that make those past events seem so much better than anything happening in the present. We look back and we think, that was better than it is right now. Here's another example of it. When I was a kid, I used to have this little, it was like a car that you would drive around in the driveway. Now, you might be thinking of like the ones that you press the gas pedal on and they're electric and they go. I was born before those were invented, so it was actually like there was little pedals inside the car. And so I imagine that this was like the most awesome thing as I think back about that in time. And while I was living in Ohio, I asked my parents, could you find that car and bring it out here because I want my kids to experience it? Well, when they brought it out, it wasn't exactly what I remembered. This is a picture of it. It's kind of broken down. It didn't have its hub. The lights were all messed up. The front was all broken. Now, my daughter is smiling while she's riding that, but I'm going to tell you, that lasted for about 13 seconds, and then this went to the curb into the dumpster. So it wasn't exactly what I had remembered. It wasn't so much fun, but in my memory, it was really great. So listen, this is what happens. We remember things from our youth as excellent and brilliant. But we forget how we decided that those things were excellent or brilliant. And we saw the world through our young eyes. And then, as we became older, we're not wowed quite as easily as we once were when we were younger, so we conclude that things were better than we were younger. It's very interesting. Now, maybe a light bulb is going off for some of you because some of you can remember yourself saying, even this week maybe you said, maybe even today you might have said, the world is so bad these days, it's not like when I was a kid and things were great. Have you ever said that before? Why is the world so bad these days? It's not so bad as when I was a kid. Or I used to feel safe in the park. Or we used to be able to go out at night and not have to lock our doors. Now, what's interesting about all of that is last night I just watched this Netflix special with my wife, Marie. And in 1983, there was like a serial killer that killed more people than ever. So like, it wasn't that great in 1983. I'm just telling you. But the truth is, here's the truth about this. When we were younger, we were more naive. And then we got older and we began to recognize the danger that was in the world. And because of our youngness, we didn't see any of those dangers, but then we got responsibility, we got age, we got experience, we had kids, and all of a sudden our view changed and we saw the world as it is. So oftentimes when we look back, we feel naive about it. Now, the world might be worse today than when you were a kid, but it definitely looks worse to us than when we were kids. And this bias, this hindsight bias, it actually has impacted worldview and decision-making for people for as long as the dawn of time. I mean, I can only imagine that Adam said to Eve, man, things just used to be so perfect. But this story this morning, we're going to, and you're chuckling to that, you're going to like elbow each other and be like, oh, that actually kind of was funny, but yeah, never mind. It's not worth a laugh out loud. It's kind of like when you're watching TV and you're like, that's funny, but I'm not going to laugh. All right. Okay, so today as we look at this story, we see God's people just stuck in the middle of the hindsight bias. And we've been working through some passages in the book of Numbers, which kind of is like a historical record of the Israelites' journey through the wilderness. Well, we're looking at a passage this morning, and they are just 1 year out of being slaves in Egypt. If you're not familiar with the story, the Israelite people had gone into Egypt as a safe haven place, but as they stayed there, they grew in population, and eventually the Egyptian people decided there's too many of these people, they could revolt, and they turned them into slaves, and they became slaves. So they were just 1 year out of being rescued from that, and this is where we pick up the story. Now the people complained about their hardships in hearing the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused. Then the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. Now, as we read this story, you're going to see that this story in Numbers chapter 11, is kind of bookended by two stories of God's anger. And it is kind of interesting, and maybe we might say it's uncomfortable. We also might say we don't understand why God is angry like this. But here's something I think we can see as we read through this. We see what God's reaction is to when his people complain. We see how he feels about complaints. So let's just read on in the story. It says, when the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So that was a place called Taberah, because the fire from the Lord had burned among them. Now, as we go through this story this morning, again, you're going to see that Moses had a unique relationship with God. And it was a relationship, I say unique because there wasn't a lot of people that had a relationship like God other than Moses. He spoke for God. He stood between God and the people of the place. And he also, when God's anger raged sometimes, Moses would stand in the gap between God and people. And something also unique about Moses is that God's Spirit was with him. God's Spirit was on him. Now, today, if you're a follower of Jesus or you've been in church for a while, we talk about the idea that when we come to faith in Jesus, when we accept him as our Savior and we decide to follow him, that we have the Holy Spirit come into our life. And the Holy Spirit is part of us. It's something that happens at the moment that we choose to believe. But as we look at some of these Old Testament texts, that wasn't the case at the time. That's a benefit of what happened after Jesus died on the cross. But for these guys, it was unique when the Spirit was on them, and Moses at this time had the Spirit of God dwelling with him. So Moses was standing in the gap for the people, but then this happened, and some of his attitude kind of changed. It says, the rabble with them began to crave other food. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat. And we remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, and also the cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. So this is interesting, right? Because like I said, these guys are only just a year out of slavery, and I think they're right in the throngs of the hindsight bias. Because how did they not remember? How do they not remember what they just experienced? They definitely experienced trauma, and that's pretty hard to forget. That's why PTSD is a thing, right? Like it's not easy to walk away from your trauma, and they definitely experienced it because the Egyptian life was physically and mentally taxing. It was very difficult for them. They had extreme harsh treatment. They were ruthlessly treated by their slave drivers. Some of the descriptive words that we read in the text are words like this that talk about their time in Egypt. It was cruel, it was misery, it was broken spirit, and there was oppression. That's how they defined the time that they spent in Egypt. But not only that, towards the end of the time that they had in Egypt, they started crying out to God. In fact, the text says that they used the word, they were groaning. God, please, please rescue us. Desperately asking God to rescue them from the Egyptian captives They wanted to be free. They cried out, "Deliver us." And it says that God heard them, and he rescued them, and he sent Moses, and he delivered them. And so they left. God parted the seas, right? It's crazy. But now to what do they remember? They got free fish over there in Egypt, good stuff. Cucumbers and melons and leeks and garlics. That was great. Take me back to that life, right? They don't want to eat the manna anymore. And so we kind of look at a description of what the manna was. And this wasn't so bad. The manna was like coriander seed, and it looked like resin. And the people went around gathering it. And then they ground it in a hand mill and crushed it in a mortar, and they cooked it in a pot and made it into loaves. And it tasted something like olive oil. It was good. It was delicious. It tasted like something that was made with olive oil. And God made a miracle happen every single night. Every night, this food fell from the sky. And like dew, it was laying there in the morning, fresh for them, ready for them to pick up. I mean, God was performing a miracle. Now tell me, if you're a survival expert that has ever gone out and tried to last a certain period of time, let alone 40 years in the desert, right? If you're a survival expert, how much would it change the game if there was just fresh food for you every single morning, right? That's the hardest part, finding food and finding water, and then shelter, right? But God was providing their food every single day. But then they were not just complaining about it. They weren't just saying, "Not this again." They were wailing. Listen to how Moses describes what they were doing. Moses heard these people of every family wailing at the entrance of their tents. I mean, I know you probably have experienced hunger before. They weren't hungry. They just wanted something else to eat. They're wailing at the entrance of their tents. And the Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. So Moses is worried about this whole thing, and God is becoming angry about that. And you might go, yeah, that kind of makes sense that God would be upset. He's providing for them every single day. He's rescued them. But here they are being upset about it. And so God has this conversation with Moses, and Moses is talking with him, and he says to God, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put this burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give birth to them? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms, as a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised on an oath to their ancestors? Where can I get meat for all of these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give me meat to eat.' I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me. If I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin." I think this is great, right? This Moses just being so honest with God, and he's laying it on thick. If this is how you're going to treat me, just kill me. Just go ahead and finish me off, God. He's just so upset about how these people are complaining. And listen, I mean, if you've ever been a leader of a group, I'm sure you've never led this many people. There was 600,000 men in this camp. And they count men when they're counting heads, right? That doesn't include the women and children. There's over 1 million people following Moses around in the desert. And they're all complaining, every single one of them. So Moses is upset. He's crying out to God. And again, we're seeing this unique relationship between God and Moses. And so I think that this picture of God and Moses together is kind of like a picture of what our relationship with God could be like now. And maybe you've experienced this before, this feeling of I just want to be honest with God. I just want to tell him exactly how I'm feeling. And you know what? I'm just going to lay it on thick. And I'm going to be open and honest. And you know what's crazy about that is that we can do that. We can come before God and we can share our struggles. We can share our burdens. And it's not too much for God. In fact, Peter, who was a follower of Jesus, penned in his book, he said the words that we should cast our anxiety on him because he cares for us. It's not too much for him for us to cast our anxieties on God. And in this moment, that's what they were doing. There's room for struggle. There's forgiveness in our relationship with God based on faith alone, not what we do. And so maybe if you're here today and you're struggling and you're thinking, maybe I've done too much to have a relationship with God. Maybe God wouldn't want me. Maybe my burdens are too heavy. Maybe he doesn't see me in my struggle. I just want you to know that after Jesus came, God sees us through the blood of Jesus, washed free of our sin. And you're invited into a relationship with him. And anyone can enter into that relationship. It doesn't matter where you've been we're all invited to know Jesus because of the cross. And that's a beautiful thing. And so if you're struggling today, maybe find someone that can articulate just how to do that, because it's not complicated. But Moses, he often doubted God. And if you're familiar with the Moses story, when God and Moses met, it's because God came to a bush and lit the bush on fire, but it wasn't burning, right? And he told Moses, this is holy ground, so take off your sandals. And so he had this conversation with God, and he told Moses, I want you to go to Egypt, and I want you to set my people free. And you remember what Moses said? He said, I can't. I can't even speak. And why would they listen to me? And I can't do any of that, God. And so he was telling God, just send somebody else. But then it's crazy that Moses doesn't understand that God can do miraculous things, because even in that moment, he told Moses, throw your staff on the ground. He threw it on the ground and it became a snake. And then he went to grab it again, and God turned it back into a staff. And then he took that staff down to Egypt and did all these miraculous signs to convince the Pharaoh to let him go. And then he held that staff over the Red Sea, and it parted, and they walked across on dry land. So why? Why would Moses ever doubt God in this moment? But here we find Moses doubting him again. Listen to how Moses and God continue in this conversation. Now the Lord will give you meat to eat. You can continue to the next one. You will not eat it just for one day, but for 2 days, or 5, or 10, or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils, until you loathe it, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wailed before him, saying, why did we ever have to leave Egypt? God's like, you know what? Just tell him this. I'm going to give you meat. I'm going to give you so much meat that it comes out of your face. That's how much meat I'm going to give you, people. And again, we find Moses in this doubt. Look at what Moses says next. But Moses said, here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say, I will give them meat to eat for a whole month? Would they have enough if all the flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? He's like, I don't, like, there's no way. Moses just looks at God and he's like, how would you ever accomplish this? How would you ever do that? There's no possible way. Again, I'm like, he parted the sea for you, Moses. Like, he brought you people out. How do you feel this way? The Lord answers him by saying this, is the Lord's arm too short? Now you will see whether or not what I say will come true for you. God's like, you want to watch? I'll show you. I'm going to show you exactly just how I can fulfill anything that I say I want to. And so he continues on. And this is just like astonishing how God answers the call here in this minute. These people are asking for meat, and Moses is complaining to God now even. And then God, he just does this incredible thing. It says, now a wind went out from the Lord and drove the quail in from the sea. It scattered them up to 2 cubits deep and all around the camp as far as a day's walk in any direction. And all that day and night and all the next day, the people went out and they gathered quail. No one gathered less than 10 homers, and then they spread them out all around the camp. Okay, now I know that some of those terms don't really make any sense, and you're kind of like, okay, that doesn't sound that great. Well, listen. He says that all the quail that came out, that they blew out from the sea, were 2 cubits deep. A cubit is from your elbow to your fingernails, right? 2 cubits deep. So it was 2 of those, like 3 foot deep, as far as you could walk in a day's direction. So for miles, there's 3 feet of quail. 3 feet. And he says, these people are going nuts. They're going out feasting. They're grabbing this meat. They're dragging it back to their tents. And it says that there was nobody at all, not one person that gathered less than, 10 homers. So let's just evaluate what 10 homers are. Let me just show you this little graphic here. 10 homers is equal to 60 bushels. Now, if you're a farmer in the place, or if you've ever gathered a bushel of apples, you know what that means. But a bushel, 60 bushels is equal to this, 2,400 pounds. That every person that gathered quail gathered 2,400 pounds of quail. I mean, it's only 2,000 pounds to make a ton. They literally had a truckload of quail on their tents. Where would you even put a truckload of quail? Can you imagine that? And then, think about this. 1 million people times 2,400 equals this number. 2.4 billion pounds of quail that God just dropped on these people. God's like, you want meat? You're going to have meat coming out of your face. That's what you're going to get. And he just dropped so much meat on them, it's insane. It's an insane amount of meat that he just dropped right on top of them. So they're cheering, they're going to get this meat, and then all of a sudden, God's attitude kind of changes in this moment. This is, again, where it's like, it's hard to understand what's going on here, but let's just read what happens next. While the meat was still between their teeth, and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against these people, and he struck them with a severe plague. And therefore the place was named Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had craved other food. Now, if your reaction to this story is like, what the heck? I think that's a normal reaction to this story. Because to see God reacting that way, I mean, we sing about a God who's love, and so it looks like, what's God doing there? And perspective can be off, and I think that the author here is showing God's anger on display, but he's showing us that God's response, what it looks like when God's responding to betrayal. Because we've all experienced betrayal before, right? I mean, you've all experienced that best friend that you thought was your best friend until the time came where you really needed him to stand up for you, but then he didn't. Or maybe you've experienced a spouse that said, I commit to be with you for your whole life, but then they left. Or maybe you've experienced something like that, but you know the feeling of betrayal and how that makes you feel crushed on the inside. But this was even deeper than betrayal for him. It was deeper because in the Israelite culture, everybody kind of knew this, that disobedience is equivalent to abandonment. It's equivalent to leaving completely. And so in their disobedience and in their complaint, they were basically looking at the God who delivered them and said, I don't want to be with you. In fact, your provision isn't good enough for me. In fact, I would rather that Pharaoh be my God instead. And so God found himself in this place of betrayal, where these people that he rescued, that he loved, and had this grand plan to set them free from their sin. Those people rejected him in that moment. And it kind of makes a little bit sense, like the betrayal that's happening here, we can relate to that a little bit. And maybe you can say, I can relate to that minus the whole plague thing, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense to us, but still at the same time, that feeling of betrayal, we've all kind of wrestled with that. And maybe parents, you can relate with this. Maybe parents, imagine if your kid just looked at you one day and said, you know what, you're not good enough for me. In fact, I don't like the fact that our house isn't as big as our friends, and all my friends' parents are cooler, and they got swimming pools, and so, you know what, I'm not grateful for anything. You've done nothing for me, right? If your kid said that to you, you start rattling off all the things in your head that you're thinking, oh, just wait, I'm going to tell you, I put a roof over your head, I put food on your table, I put clothes on your back, you ungrateful little, fill in the blank, that's how we would be feeling in that moment if our kids said something like that to us. And you might feel they have no idea what you've given for them, no idea how much you've worked for them. So he's relatable. But I can't pretend to understand. I can't pretend to understand God's anger here, but I can get a picture of exactly what is going on here because I see this truth in life to be true, that there's a deep moral flaw in all of us when we try to find happiness and fulfillment in anything but God's provision. There's a deep moral flaw in us when we say, I've got to chase something else. God's not enough for me. What he's provided for me isn't enough. I can't be content with that. I need more. And we chase after more, and something happens in us, and destruction is right around the corner when we allow ourselves to go in that direction. And the severity of leaning in that direction, it always brings destruction into our life. The truth is, we could last in the wilderness, in any wilderness we're experiencing, when we trust in God's provision. We could. And that's why I think this is true. That contentment is the key to joy in the wilderness. Contentment is the key to joy in the wilderness. You think about what happens when we decide to be content. So Paul, the Apostle Paul, who wrote a good portion of the New Testament, he was writing a letter to the Philippians. And he wrote us this statement, which should stick with us. Here's what he said. You probably heard it before. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I've learned to be content in whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. When we decide to say that Jesus is enough, we can face anything. Doesn't matter what wilderness we're in, when we decide to be content, it all changes because life isn't found when we have fulfilled desires. Peace, love, joy, hope is found when I'm content and letting Jesus be enough for me. I think the hindsight dilemma is something that we all kind of struggle with. It lies to us and tells us that life was better then, but it's not. It's better now when I choose to be content in the present, in this moment. And contentment just literally means that I'm happy with what I have and who I am and where I am in life. Let me read that again. What I have, who I am, and where I am in life. It doesn't mean it's complacency or an absence of desire. It just means that I'm satisfied with my current place in life, with my present. And I'm trusting that my future twists and turns and all that might come into my life might be the best when I am trusting it with God. So what would happen in your life right now if you decided to replace complaints with satisfaction? What would happen in your life right now if you decided to replace questions with trust? Because contentment brings these things, and I want you to think about how it could bring these into your life in this moment. Contentment brings peace. Contentment brings happiness. Contentment brings stronger relationships. Think about how that plays out in your life. Stronger relationships when we're content. Contentment brings simplicity. Contentment is the key to joy in the wilderness. So you might not want to be where you are in life, but is God enough for you where you are? You might want to be younger. Maybe you keep having birthdays and saying, I don't want to have any more birthdays. But is God enough for you where you are? You might wish that you had more fill in the blank. But is God enough for you where you are? Because destruction is right around the corner for us when we seek out more than what God's providing for us in our life. And if we can recognize anything in that passage as people were complaining and longing for more than God's provision, just destruction was impending. And that's true for us too. So what's the more that you've been craving right now? What's the meat that you've been seeking after? What have you been wailing to God about and desired to have more of? And can you choose to trust God where you are, with who you are, and what you bring to the table? Can you lay down that desire for more, trusting that God is enough for you? Because Paul articulated this so well for us. The secret of being content is recognizing that I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Contentment is the key to joy in the wilderness. Jesus, I just pray that this morning you would help us to recognize that we don't have to chase more. And sometimes our more and our desire for more can feel like betrayal to you. And God, in no way do I want you to feel betrayed after all that you've done for me. But also, God, I do thank you that I can bring my questions and I can bring my doubts, and it's okay, and we can wrestle with those together because of the relationship that we are offered. And that's incredible. But God, I just pray that today you would help me to recognize in my life that what I have and who I am, the person that you made me to be, and what I can bring to the table, those things are enough. And I thank you, God, that as I trust your provision, it brings a whole lot of peace and simplicity and joy and happiness to my life. God, I pray that you'd help us to lean into this truth. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Guys, it's been so awesome being with you today. We hope to see you back again. Next week, we're going to wrap up this series, The Wilderness, and we'd love to see you then. All right, we'll see you guys later.